everybody, if you're like me and crazy about March and March Madness, you're probably wondering right about now how your team is going to be doing or where they're going to be seated in the NCAA tournament. So we get this question a lot during our live streams while we're watching Duke games. It's like, what seed is Duke going to be? Where's my favorite team going to end up? And so we figured we would put together a little segment. We're going to bring in our resident bracketologist, Dr. Lochale, over here, and he's going to help us understand how seeding works in the NCAA tournament. So we're going to look at a couple things and a couple tools and metrics that the NCAA committee uses to actually seed teams in the tournament bracket. These include the NCAA evaluation tool, which is otherwise known as the net. You see that on the left-hand side of the screen. We'll also talk about the quadrant system. If you're watching ESPN from time to time, you'll hear the talking heads talk about, oh, that's a great quad one win, or they have a lot of quad one wins, or that's a terrible loss. And that's a terrible loss because of where those losses end up falling in the quadrants. And we'll also talk about the S curve or the seeding curve and how teams actually end up on the bracket. All right, so Justin, welcome in. Thanks for taking the time to put this together here for us. You're going to give us a brief history lesson, and then we're going to jump right into it. So tell me, in the beginning.
So this is actually a really interesting time because there has been a lot of changes recently to how the committee or what the committee uses to actually seed teams. So previously, before 2017, it was based on just the RPI. And so the RPI, that was the primary tool, and that's all they used. However, all it really calculated was the strength of schedule of each team by factoring in the winning percentage of your team, their opponent's winning percentage, and then their opponent's winning percentage. And so you didn't really get a lot of information from it besides how teams are doing. You didn't factor in, was it an away game, a neutral site? What were the teams ranked? How were their efficiencies? As we've come to see that metric bounce a lot or come up a lot in things like KenPom ratings. How about travel time? Were these long away games or were these a really short 2-hour or 10-minute bus ride to Chapel Hill? So it was a very poor predictor of a team's true ability once they actually got into March. So that started some conversations, and a lot of the talking heads were pretty angry at teams that were getting left out come March, and that spurred the committee to add what is called the quadrant system to it, which we're going to go over next.
So then we got quadrants.
Yes, we got quadrants. This is the NCAA's method of objectively quantifying the quality of a team's wins or losses based on their opponent and where it is played. So they award points for each quadrant. Yep. And this goes into the quality of win metric in the net that we'll talk about in a few moments. And so the quadrant system heavily favors away and neutral site games, and it actually slightly downgrades home games. And we'll explain that in a little bit.
Yeah, so up here on the screen right now is we have the quadrants explained. So as Justin was saying, 4 quadrants, and if you play the game at home, at a neutral site, or on the road or away, you get different points based on how high that team is ranked and where you play them, right? So, in a quadrant 1, you could be a home game, and if the team is ranked between 1 and 30 and you beat them at home, it's a quad 1 win. But if you go on the road and beat a team that's, say, ranked 50, it counts the same.
Yes, it counts the same. And so that's the NCAA saying that it's just harder to win games in neutral sites, which is NCAA tournament for the most part, and then in true road games. And so they're trying to give value to those tougher games where you are in hostile environments, which is a thing in college basketball more so than the NBA. But what you also have is now beating the number 1 team at home or away is equivalent to beating the 75th ranked team in an away match. And we'll talk about how there's some discrepancies there as well. And the other piece, the net rankings, which we're going to talk about again in just a moment, are updated and adjusted daily. And an opponent's future performances, so how they do well after you play them, may change that initial classification of that game from a quadrant 1 game to potentially a quadrant 2 game, or quadrant 2 to quadrant 3 to quadrant 4, and we have some examples for you towards the end of the show.
Yeah, it gets a little nutty. So needless to say, we started with the RPI. we got a bit more enlightened with the quadrants, and then we actually
Mm-hmm.
combined them. We were using both to see which
Mm-hmm.
teams are going to get into the tournament.
Yep.
All right, and then we decided this RPI thing is terrible.
Mm-hmm.
Let's just get rid of it entirely and replace
Mm-hmm.
it with what you saw before on the left-hand side, which was the net and actually
Mm-hmm.
how you build the bracket here. So we're gonna start, you saw the graphic as how it gets
Mm-hmm.
played out, but we're gonna go step by step. The first thing we have to do, now that we have our quadrants, is we have
Mm-hmm.
to build the net. So Justin, how
Yes.
do we build the net?
So again, this was developed first in 2018. So last season was the first time the net was actually used. And this is the main tool. So remember that the net is the main tool the NCAA committee and the selection committee uses. So when they're weighting teams, the net ranking weighs the most. And so it is made up of the game results and the quality of wins, as well as strength of schedule. It factors in the game location where it was played,
Mhm.
your scoring margin, your offensive, defensive efficiency, which they have a calculation for, as well as the quality of win. And that's based off of your quadrant system. Now, each of these variables is weighted differently. So the quality of win, as you see up at the top of that graphic, that's the number one weighted thing. All the way down to scoring margin is the least weighted thing in the net. Now, we don't know exactly how the calculation works. The NCAA says they designed it with Google and via machine learning. And so we actually don't know what the actual regression equation is that spits out the output that determines the net rankings. However, it does something, and
Yeah,
we'll
it's a bit
figure
of
it out.
magic.
It's a bit of magic. But a couple key points with what the net doesn't include. So the date of the game, whether it's early or late, is not factored in at all. So early games that you play day one of your season is equally as important as your conference tournament games. And they cap the score margin. So your scoring margin, you could beat a team by 40. It doesn't matter. According to the net, you only get a 10-point win booster. And overtime games, you only get a 1-point win booster, regardless of what the final score is. So there's some interesting decisions that they made in terms of where to cap games. According to the NCAA's website, they said they capped it at 10 to decrease the likelihood of unsportsmanlike conduct by running up the scores.
All right, and so then we have, in addition to the net, so we have our net, and then we're going to try to start to build the
Mm-hmm.
actual bracket. So
Yes.
in order to do that, we actually bring in a couple other factors
Yes.
that the NCAA committee is going to look at. One of these is called the Basketball Power Index.
Yeah. So the BPI, this is an ESPN created metric. So they've used their own statisticians to create this. And it's a power rating that can be used to determine how much better one team is compared to the other team. And it truly is best used to predict the probability of a team beating another team. So you see the some of those graphics that ESPN will have if you go watch the game casts on their website. You'll see kind of those win percentage totals, and that's based primarily off of the BPI, and it's adjusted a little bit based on how that game is going. And with the BPI, the reason they can say this team is that much better compared to another team is because in the calculation, they normalize all teams based on how they would do against the average Division One team, and that on a neutral court. And so that's where they're able to say every team starts here. We're comparing it against an average. One team's up here, one team's down here. And then you have their power rating.
Right. Then you add the strength of record.
So strength of record, it builds on the strength of schedule, which was something that the RPI calculated. But the strength of record, it compares how the team actually did, so their actual game results measures against a prediction model for its schedule. And they run that prediction model, I believe, over 1,000 times of how the 25th ranked team would do against every schedule in college basketball, and however much better you or worse your team does against that prediction is what determines your strength of record. ESPN does claim that this metric truly determines who should be in the NCAA tournament based on their body of work and their resume, because this is based on a very elaborate prediction of how someone would do against your schedule. And they have actually numbers. So over the past 5 seasons, 94% of teams that the strength of record deemed deserving to make the tournament ended up making the field of 68, which is actually pretty stellar when you
Right.
think about it.
Then we have some of the more subjective metrics that people have probably heard of. They've heard of things like the eye test, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, this
Mm-hmm.
team looks better and plays better than this other one. Or we take into
Mm-hmm.
account injuries, right? Last year, Zion was out for a large part
Mm-hmm.
of the back half of the Duke season, and then he came back, and then the team got hot again. So that's the next one. Is this team
Mm-hmm.
coming into March really playing its best basketball? And the geography, as far as like where the teams actually end up,
Mm-hmm.
will play as to how the seeds are actually constructed and
Yes.
where people start falling on the actual bracket. So that
Mm-hmm.
is it's a bit more on of a subjective factor on the next one when you actually start to
Yes.
build the S curve.
Mm-hmm.
But basically, you get all this information right in what is
Yes.
called a team sheet.
Mm-hmm.
And oh my goodness, this is what a team sheet looks like.
Yes. And I'm not going to lie, this is straight from the NCAA. These are publicly available, they are updated daily. Here's Duke's team sheet as of March 7th. So it does factor in our win against North Carolina. And it really is a useful document. So this is exactly what the committee is given for each team. Each team that is under consideration, they get this one sheet of paper called the team sheet, and it has everything. So it has the net ranking up in the top.
Right
You've
here.
got, yep, you've got your Ken Palm index, you've got your strength of record right there, your
Mhm.
BPI, all factored in. There's even a strength of schedules. And then you see at the bottom the breakdown of all the quadrants. So the quadrants come back into play. So that's your resume, essentially. Like this is a team's resume right here. And this is what the committee is factoring in as they're going about it. So you can see for us, for example, we're 5-3 against quad one. You'll see the red boxes are the games that we
That we
lost.
lost.
And
Right.
and you can tell they mark home and away, so then you can look and correspond what that team's net ranking was, and then say, okay, yep, away game against Syracuse, they're net 54. Perfect, that fits in quad one. Then you look and you see quad two, you see we have a very large number of quad three wins, and then two quad four wins as well.
Yep. And then these quads, as we mentioned earlier, they actually change. So
Yes.
this is the team sheet from today.
Mm-hmm.
However, if we look back at a team sheet from just a week ago, we're going to
Mm-hmm.
see that there's been changes to how these things play out. Look, they have this upcoming game against North Carolina here, a
Mm-hmm.
potential quad three win, which we do end up winning, and then Carolina pops in to this column here.
Mm-hmm.
So that was our 89-76 win down there. But you see that Wofford has moved over actually
Yes.
back a week ago. Wofford was a quad four win, and now
Mm-hmm.
they're a quad three win. So they actually give us an extra point because they've been
Yes.
playing better of late, and so
Mm-hmm.
that actually helps us out.
Yes.
Yep. So
E-
go ahead.
except this is games through February. Go to March 1st.
Yep.
If you see bottom of quad one, it's our away loss against Clemson. That's a quad one loss. Okay, that's not a bad loss. We're not going to get punished too much by the committee for that. Fast forward to March 7th, it is now a quad two loss
Yep.
because Clemson has not been playing so well and they've struggled and their net ranking has dropped. And so you can see the volatility of it changing daily. And so the net rankings and everything doesn't necessarily matter early on. It really matters really late as teams start to solidify themselves a little bit more. So come Selection Sunday, that's your resume. Wherever those teams finish,
Yep.
that's regardless if they were number 5 when you played them, if they're now number 85, it's not as impactful of a win anymore.
All right. So now that we have the team sheets in front of us, and imagine we're the committee, right? We can build
Yes.
our S curve. So we have all this data. We're using the team sheets.
Mm-hmm.
We have this giant 373-page PDF packet with all
Mm-hmm.
the teams. We have the S curve. So we take the S curve and we use some of these guidelines, like the fact that, an at-large team cannot be lower than a 12 seed. Usually
Mm-hmm.
you see the 12 to 16 seeds reserved for some of the mid-major conferences where their net score is going to be up in the hundreds hundreds, perhaps, right? But they get into the tournament because they have the automatic qualifier. Then you have teams from the same conference cannot meet before the Sweet 16. We saw this last year with Duke and Virginia Tech playing in the Sweet 16. And then, as we mentioned above, geography is a little subjective. You can actually move teams on the seeding lines to try to keep them close to home.
Yes. Yep.
And then finally, you get a bracket.
Yes. Finally, you get a bracket, and then the committee will publish once they finalize that seed curve and then put it into the bracket, that's what they publish.
Right.
And we actually have an example from last year that we're going to show you.
Yes, and this is the example here from last year where you look at the net rankings on the right-hand side, and you can see, again, there's the BPI and the strength of record, those two other factors, all three factors, the net, the BPI, and the strength of record that we talked about. 1 through 16, the top four seeds, basically seeds 1 through 4 throughout the entire NCAA tournament. That's how they would have fallen if we went specific, like just based off the net. However, when we flip over to the S curve and the actual seeding of how it plays out, you see Duke ends up on the number 1 overall seed, even though it was third in the net. Perhaps because Virginia burned the committee the year before with the top overall seed and then losing in the first round. But or because Zion was back and the committee decided to bump them up. But in any case, it makes for some interesting matchups, right? Because Justin, as you were saying, some of them played out a little differently in the actual tournament.
Yes. So we ended up getting Michigan State, which we were all very upset about in terms of getting that 2 seed. And if you look at the S curve from that year, Michigan State was ranked 6th. And so as the number 1 seed, we should have then, according to everything, we should have got Michigan.
Well, they were ranked 8th.
They were ranked 8th. So they pair the top 1 with the bottom 2. So we should have gotten Michigan according to their S curve. Why did they move things? We have absolutely no idea. I'm assuming it was a geography thing, although it doesn't make sense for Michigan and Michigan State because they're from the same state. Whatever. Storylines.
Right.
However, if you look at the net itself, we should have been, if they followed the net exclusively, we would have been the third 1 seed, so number 3 overall. And we would have actually been paired with Kentucky as our 2 seed, which Kentucky ended up being, I believe they were 2. Yeah, they were a 2 seed, and they ended up in UNC's bracket.
Right.
But you see, UNC was 7 in the net. And then they jumped to 3 on the S curve. And so this is where some of the inner workings of the committee pop up, and we don't really know what they're talking about. We don't know why they make their decisions. Yes, the head of the committee comes out and tries to explain it all, but half the time it's a very much oh, we thought they had a better resume.
Right.
Oh, we thought this. However, I mean, the resume is right in front of you, and everyone can look at their each team's resume via the team sheets, and you can come to your own conclusions. So it's the subjectivity and some of the biases in the selection process. I'm curious to see this year with the second year of the net if it follows a little bit more consistently and there's less bias. Like Houston was 4 on the net and they were dropped to number 9. I don't know why.
Right. So still a bit of subjectivity, and there's a bit of the mystery of the committee itself. All right, so let's do a quick recap here as we can go back. So to quickly recap,
yes,
this process is extensive, right? But you can break it down into a couple steps. So Justin, quick recap for everybody.
So the selection committee will primarily use the net, so the NCAA evaluation tool, to create the seed curve that they eventually fill in the bracket. They're also going to use other metrics, such as their strength of record, so how well that team did against how challenging their record was, the basketball power index, so that's just a power ranking of who's better than who, according to how they would do against an average team, and then the quadrant system, the quad 1, 2, 3, and 4, wins and losses. But then they're also going to use the subjectivity, such as the eye test, to factor in, and which is why we don't think that last year's net rankings perfectly matched the seed list that was actually published. But when it all comes down, the net ranking is the one thing that the NCAA Selection Committee is going to focus on the most.
Right. All right. And with that, that is basically what we're expecting to see come a week from now into
Hmm.
Selection Sunday. Justin is going to go off and create his own bracket. Justin, I think
Hmm.
you have Duke pegged as a current 3 seed
I
for the
do.
time being, which our
Hmm.
Blue Devils, based on how they've landed on their team sheet, will have an opportunity to improve upon that in the
Hmm.
in the ACC tournament rather. But we will see what happens. We're going to review your bracket, Justin,
Yes.
before our selection or during our Selection Sunday show, but before the official bracket
Yep.
is revealed. So come
Hmm.
back here to Relive Sports starting at 5:30 Eastern Time next Sunday, March 15th. We'll be on Twitch and YouTube. And Justin will reveal his bracket. Then we'll
Yes.
see the real one, and then we'll pick all of our brackets live on stream.
Hmm.
And so there you have it. That is how seeding is done in the NCAA tournament. Thanks, everybody. Cheers. Go Duke.
Thank you. Go Duke.